cops slapped a black woman in court, but they didn't know who she really was. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, a place where truth mattered more than power. But on that day, it became a stage for humiliation. A black woman walked in, carrying only her courage, hoping to be heard. Instead, she was silenced, mocked, dismissed, and struck across the face by the very people sworn to protect the law. Gasps filled the room. Some looked away. Others pulled out their phones, recording every second of her humiliation. But what no one knew, not the officers, not the judge sitting high above, not even the crowd whispering in shock, was that she wasn't just another woman begging for dignity. She held a secret, a truth that would flip the balance of power in seconds. The same courtroom that tried to break her would soon kneel before her authority. How could the humiliated victim suddenly rise to claim the highest seat in the room? This is the story they never saw coming. Her name was Maya Johnson. To most, she was just another face in the crowd, a hard-working woman trying to build a life in a world that often refused to see her worth. By day, she poured herself into her studies, late nights filled with law books stacked high on her kitchen table. By night, she worked double shifts at a community center, helping teenagers who, like her, had grown up feeling invisible. What many never knew was that Maya carried a fire inside her. She wasn't just chasing a degree, she was chasing justice. Every page she studied, every case she reviewed, was fueled by a lifetime of watching her neighbors, friends, and family silenced by a system that promised fairness but delivered anything but. The courthouse she entered that morning wasn't new to her. She had been there before, sitting quietly in the back rows, observing trials like puzzles she needed to solve. But today was different. Today, she was there as a plaintiff, standing up against a powerful organization that thought they could trample her without consequence. She had filed a case challenging misconduct by local officials, an act that already put a target on her back. The moment she walked through the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers followed her down the aisle, as if her presence was a disruption. Court officers eyed her with suspicion, not professionalism. To them, she wasn't a woman fighting for fairness, she was a problem that needed to be managed. Still, Maya carried herself with quiet strength. Her crisp blazer, worn but clean, was more than clothing, it was armor. She knew the odds were against her. She knew the system wasn't designed for women like her to win. But she also knew this, the truth had power, and she wasn't going to back down. As she sat at the plaintiff's table, she glanced around the courtroom. The judge seemed distracted, the jury unimpressed, the officers leaning casually against the walls as though justice was a performance, not a duty. The air was heavy with dismissal. As though the outcome had already been decided before the first word was spoken. And yet, Maya didn't flinch. She placed her notes neatly in front of her, took a slow breath, and waited. She wasn't naive, she knew the storm was coming. She could feel it in the stares, the smirks. The quiet chuckles exchanged between uniforms. But what they couldn't see was the resolve in her heart. The kind of unshakable calm that comes only from knowing you have nothing left to lose. This was more than a case for Maya. This was her stand, her line in the sand. She was ready for the fight, ready for the injustice she knew would come. What she didn't know, however, was just how far that injustice would go. Or how, by the end of the day, the entire courtroom would see her in a way they never expected. The courtroom was supposed to be a temple of order and fairness. But the moment Maya's case began, it became something else entirely. The judge, a man who had held the gavel for decades, barely looked at her when the clerk announced her name. His eyes skimmed the room, lingering longer on the defense table, as though their presence carried more weight than hers. Maya presented her arguments calmly, carefully, each word chosen with precision. She cited laws, precedents, and evidence that pointed to misconduct. She spoke with clarity, not desperation. But still the courtroom treated her like background noise. The defense lawyer interrupted her constantly, rolling his eyes, muttering under his breath, and at times even laughing out loud. Each interruption should have been checked by the judge. It wasn't. Each dismissal should have been met with order in the court. It wasn't. Instead, it became clear. The system wasn't simply against Maya. It was actively pushing her down. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, many smirking at the audacity of a black woman daring to challenge authority in their house of law. Still, Maya pressed forward, steadying her voice even as her hands trembled slightly under the table. Then it happened. As Maya leaned over her stack of papers, presenting a crucial piece of evidence, one of the court officers shifted closer. His boots echoed on the floor like a warning. She glanced up, meeting his cold stare. He wasn't there to protect order. He was there to intimidate. Her words continued, but the tension thickened. She had just laid out the part of her case that proved the misconduct was not only real but deliberate. She expected resistance, but not what came next. A sharp voice cut through the courtroom. "Sit down already. You've said enough." It wasn't the judge. It was the officer. Maya froze. For a second, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The defense attorney smirked. The judge stayed silent. The gallery leaned forward like spectators at a fight. And then, before Maya could even gather a response, the officer stepped closer and, with an open hand, slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the courtroom louder than the gavel ever had. Papers scattered, her glasses fell to the floor, and gasps erupted from the benches behind her. The humiliation was immediate. Her cheek burned, not just from the strike but from the eyes locked on her. Some wide with shock, others glittering with cruel satisfaction. This wasn't just an attack, it was a public attempt to erase her voice. To remind her that in their world, she didn't belong. Maya's hands trembled, but not from fear. It was anger. Deep, simmering anger, the kind born of years of being dismissed, disrespected, and devalued. Her body screamed to stand up, to fight back. But she knew if she lashed out, they would twist the narrative instantly, aggressive, out of control, unfit. And yet, something shifted inside her. Because in that moment, standing in the middle of a courtroom filled with silence after violence, Maya realized something the rest of them had forgotten. She wasn't just a plaintiff. She was a law scholar, a future attorney, and someone who understood every crack in the very system they were trying to use against her. The officer had struck her to humiliate her, to put her in her place. Instead, he had lit a fuse. The courtroom thought it had witnessed Maya's defeat. What they didn't know was that it had just set the stage for her rise. The sting of the slap lingered. But what lingered even more was the silence that followed. A silence so loud it pressed against Maya's ears, against her chest, against her very breath. Every person in the room knew what had just happened was wrong, yet no one moved. Not the defense attorney with his smug grin. Not the judge whose gavel sat untouched. Not even the jury whose eyes darted anywhere but hers. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if the system had swallowed her whole. She was meant to shrink, to collapse into the corner of that courtroom. A warning to anyone else who might dare raise their voice. But Maya did not shrink. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her chair. The papers that had spilled to the floor remained scattered. But she did not stoop to pick them up. Her back straightened, her chin lifted, and the fire in her eyes silenced even the whispers in the gallery. Her cheeks still burned. But it was no longer a mark of shame, it was a scar being written into history. She locked her gaze on the officer, who had already taken a half-step back. His hand twitched as if unsure whether to reach for his belt or simply disappear. Then, she turned her eyes toward the bench. The judge, once untouchable in his authority, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't ordered the slap. He hadn't stopped it either. And Maya knew, in that moment, that his silence had condemned him just as much as the officer's violence had. With slow steps, she walked forward, not toward her chair. Not toward the exit, but toward the bench itself. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One juror's mouth fell open. The defense attorney sputtered something about contempt. But his voice sounded thin. Irrelevant, like background noise. The officer moved to block her path, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her hand, not in aggression, but in command. Don't. Her voice was low, steady, and sharper than any gavel. To everyone's surprise, including her own, the officer froze. Each step forward felt like a shift in gravity. The balance of the courtroom was changing. The weight of centuries of injustice pressed against Maya's shoulders. But she carried it, step by step, until she stood at the foot of the judge's bench. For a second, no one breathed. Then, without hesitation, Maya climbed the steps. Her palms pressed against the wood as she pulled herself higher, until she was standing where no one had imagined she would be, at the judge's seat. The very place they thought she could never reach. The place reserved for authority, for control, for power. The judge half rose from his chair, his face pale. But his words stumbled and died before they could escape. Because in that moment, it wasn't him the room looked to, it was her. The gallery sat frozen, a mix of awe and fear in their eyes. The jury leaned forward, caught in the storm. The defense attorney's smirk was gone, replaced by disbelief. And Maya, her hands resting firmly on the bench, her body standing tall, looked out at them all. No gavel needed. No robe required. The message was clear: she was not just another plaintiff to be silenced. Not just another victim to be erased. She was the embodiment of the justice they had denied her. The voice they had tried to strip away. The same system that tried to humiliate her had just been flipped upside down. And though she didn't yet speak, the sight alone said everything. You can strike me. You can dismiss me. You can try to erase me. But you will never silence me. The courtroom that once hummed with murmurs now sat in absolute silence. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Maya, standing behind the bench where only authority was meant to reside. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. The officer who had struck her shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of the weight of his actions. The defense attorney, who had moments earlier laughed at her presence, now sat pale and speechless. Even the judge, the man who had ruled this chamber for decades, seemed small, his robe, his gavel. His position diminished in the shadow of the woman who now stood before them. Maya didn't need to slam the gavel or shout for order. Her presence was the order. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, clear and deliberate, cutting through the thick air like lightning splitting the night. She did not scream about the slap. Nor did she waste her breath on those who had mocked her. Instead, she spoke about truth. About justice. About what it meant to fight for dignity in a system built to strip it away. She told the courtroom that she had walked in as a plaintiff. But she stood now as something greater. Not because of the violence inflicted upon her, but because she refused to bow to it. She told them the law was not just ink on paper, but a promise, one that demanded accountability, even from those who claimed to enforce it. The gallery leaned forward, unable to look away. For some, her words stirred shame. For others, they stirred recognition, a spark of courage they hadn't felt before. The officer who had struck her was escorted out, his silence louder than any defense he could have offered. The judge, shaken and cornered by his own inaction, could not reclaim control. And as Maya's words filled the room, it became clear that the trial unfolding was no longer about her case alone. It was about the very soul of the system itself. When she finally stepped down from the bench, she didn't return to the plaintiff's table. She walked straight through the courtroom doors, her head high, her steps firm. The crowd parted like water, watching her pass. She had entered the courthouse as one woman fighting for justice. But she left it as a symbol, an embodiment of what it meant to resist, to rise. To demand change even when the world told you to sit down and stay silent. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the walls of that courtroom. Headlines carried her name. Communities whispered about her courage. Activists held up her act not as rebellion, but as reclamation. What had been meant to humiliate her had instead sparked conversations that echoed far beyond a single slap. Some called her reckless. Others called her brave. But one thing was certain, no one forgot her. And as for Maya, she didn't stop there. That day had revealed to her not only the cruelty of the system, but also her power within it. She pushed harder, studied longer, fought louder. The courtroom that tried to silence her had only accelerated her rise. Years later, when she returned to the same courthouse, it wasn't as a plaintiff. It wasn't as a bystander. It was as the one wearing the robe. The one holding the gavel. And those who remembered the day she had been slapped knew exactly what her presence meant. History had shifted. Because sometimes, the act meant to break you becomes the very act that defines you. And so the question remains, for those watching, for those listening, for those who sit quietly in the face of injustice. When the system tries to silence you, will you shrink into the shadows? Or will you rise and claim your seat at the bench of your own story?